All right, y'all, you're locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are reviewing the film from the Falcons' Week 6 win over the 49ers. We'll be talking about the 2 second-round picks in depth and why the 49ers game was Arnold Ebiketie's breakout game, why it wasn't quite the same for Troy Andersen, and we'll go in depth in the offensive line's improvements, and we'll talk about why it's owed to good coaching.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. your very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. It will help you find the right candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. So, guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons part of the proud Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. But we thank you guys for making it your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify, and of course, YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Hit that bell, give us a like so that you can get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So let's talk about the defensive rookies. We'll talk about Arnold Ebiketie, DeAngelo Malone, and Troy Andersen later in the episode. But let's start with Arnold Ebiketie. He had his best game on Sunday against the 49ers. Pro Football Focus credited him with 5 pressures in this game. I credited him in my charting with 6, technically 7. Had a sack as well that would have counted, but it was nullified by penalty. He really feasted on the 49ers backup off in this game. I counted 4 of those pressures, including that sack, going up against the 49ers third string left tackle, Jalen Moore, who's filling in for an injured Trent Williams. I counted 1 against Blake Hance, who stepped in initially for Mike McGlinchey in the first half. Then Hance was replaced by Daniel Brunskill in the second half, and Ebiketie had 1 pressure against him. He also had a pressure I counted against center Jake Brindle on a stunt at the beginning of the second half. And I also noted in my charting what moves he used on those particular pass rush plays against the 2 right tackles. He used a chop rip against Hance and a rip move against Brunskill. He used a bull rush against Brindle. Against Moore, he was mostly relying on his length. He did beat him on that sack with an arm over move, but the other 3 pressures were a long arm, a stab, and a stab rip. So we've talked about Arnold Ebiketie the last couple of weeks, putting things together, right, these last couple of weeks and hoping that it would start to pay off for him as the season progressed. Obviously, they did pay off for him in this game, but I can't help but notice that he was feasting on backups, right? What I will say is, most pass rush production in the NFL, this is a dirty little secret. I don't know if they'll come for me by saying this, but most pass rush production in the NFL goes against lower level tackles, right? Like, you're only going to really beat Jake Matthews in a game once, maybe twice, David Bakhtiari once, Trent Williams once, those types of guys. The guys that are beating those caliber of tackles, the high caliber, high quality tackles, 3, 4, 5 times in a game, usually that's like Von Miller or Nick Bosa, that level of pass rusher. For pretty much everybody else, they're racking up their production against the lesser offensive tackles, the starters, or, in the instance of what we saw on Sunday, backups that are inserted in the lineup due to an injury or something like that. And I'm going to digress a little bit from Arnold Ebiketie for a second, but later in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about why and how the offensive line has improved. But this is part of the reason why this notion of you got to have good offensive linemen is why you hear me constantly talk about investing resources in your offensive line. Because as you guys well know, you're only as strong as your weakest link, right? And I know there's going to be this expectation from a lot of folks that, particularly if this offensive line continues to play well this season, I think there's going to be a lot of Falcon fans and media people that are going to probably get a little complacent with that. and particularly when it comes to the offseason, and feel like investing further resources in the offensive line is not necessarily. But, I want to reiterate this point. I want to plant that seed. Like, you got to keep investing in this offensive line, no matter how good you think it is moving forward. But getting back to Arnold Ebiketie, I thought the other thing that stood out in this game, other than just, beating up on bad tackles, was how much the Falcons asked him to rush from the right side of the defensive line. Now, prior to this week, according to PFF, 7% of his pass rush snaps came rushing from the right side of defense, which is going up against the left side of the offense, so going up against the left tackle. But in this 49ers game, 70% of his pass rush snaps came going up against the left tackle. And I don't know if that was intentional by the Falcons for whatever reason. It was just kind of the luck of the draw. If that's something that we're going to see moving forward, that we're going to see Carter, who was primarily going up against the left tackles, and Ebiketie going up the right tackle, we'll see that flip. We'll see them sort of balance out two things. We'll see. But just something that was notable to me in this game. And when it comes to Arnold Ebiketie, I'm very curious to see particularly, how he plays the rest of the season. Because I think this week is going to be a great opportunity for him to kind of really be a better litmus test for how much growth he has shown, because he's going to face two tackles potentially in Jonah Williams and Lyle Collins for the Bengals, who are proven pass protectors, have played at a high level throughout their careers, but this year are kind of struggling a little bit. So it's kind of that best of both worlds, where it's like, okay, like, you won't have me on next week's episode if Ebiketie has another good performance, being like, oh, well, he beat up on bad tackles. Like, no, Williams and Collins aren't necessarily looking like great tackles. So that's where you feel like, okay, Ebiketie can do some work against these guys. But at the same time, like, they're proven enough where you can't just simply say, like, well, Jalen Moore was projected as a guard going in the league. Brunskill has played guard mostly in the league. And Blake Hance is similar in that regard. Although technically, I think a lot of people were projecting Jonah Williams and Lyle Collins to be guards in the league. But that's not the point. You get what I'm saying. But let's in the Arnold Ebiketie conversation, let's talk briefly about DeAngelo Malone before we get into the Troy Andersen conversation. DeAngelo Malone, I did credit with a hurry against Brunskill in the third quarter. He used an outside swim move, used him to use his speed in that regard. And I kind of joked on Twitter that it took me a minute to recognize who number 51. I was like, who's 51 on this team? Did we sign someone in the practice squad? And it took a second, and I was like, oh, that's DeAngelo Malone. And that kind of speaks to how much impact he's been having through the first couple of games this season, to the point that I kind of forgot who he was. And so hopefully for DeAngelo Malone, he will be less forgettable in the future, because he'll continue to make plays as he did on that one snap against the 49ers. But that's where we'll leave those two guys. We'll talk more about the other second round draft pick in Troy Andersen, and talk a little bit about why I think people might want to pump the brakes on proclaiming this 49ers game as a breakout performance for Troy Andersen. But before we get there, guys, the Falcons are in the process of, trying to find the right pass rushers so that they can fire on all cylinders. And maybe your small business is looking for the right people, and LinkedIn Jobs is here to make it easier for you to find all the right people that you want to talk to faster and for free. You can create a free job post in minutes in LinkedIn Jobs and reach the world's largest professional network of over 800 million people. LinkedIn Jobs helps you spread the word that you're hiring, and gives you the simple tools like screening questions makes it easy for you to focus on the candidates that have the right skills and experience, so that you can quickly prioritize who you want to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs is going to help you find the candidates that you want to talk to faster. Did you know that every week nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? Just post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So, guys, before we continue today's episode, I do want to plug the Locked On NFL podcast, which is giving you the lowdown on all the other 31 teams all week long, every single day. And definitely check out Locked On NFL on Friday to get those weekly predictions and spotlight the top 5 games heading into week 7. Of course, Locked On NFL is free and available on all the same podcast platforms you're currently checking out Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So let's talk about Troy Andersen. And so you guys that are watching the video version of that just saw me post a clip of Michael Keaton looking at the bat signal in Batman Returns, and this is basically my bat signal, because anytime I see Falcon fans overrating a player, I got to be Batman. I got to don the cape and go out and fight, I guess, the bad fight. I saw a lot of praise of Troy Andersen's performance on Sunday, and I just wasn't that impressed in his performance. And, I saw a number of people sort of touting the tackle numbers. I know AJ Evans, you sent an email to me. I'm sure you're going to leave a comment here on this video talking about this, sort of touting, the impact of Troy Andersen's tackles and whatnot. And, when I see people touting tackle numbers, in the year of our Lord 2022, in a post Paul Warlow year, especially when Falcon fans are doing this, I just kind of baffled by it. And is part of the reason why when I see fans and analysts touting like yardage totals and yards per game and stuff like that, I'm still baffled by that, because like you should know in the year of our Lord 2022 that like all yards are not created equal. And that's why you hear me use metrics that kind of qualify yards, like DVOA and success rate and stuff like that, as opposed to just simply looking at yards and all that stuff. And same thing applies with tackles, right? Like I use stops rather than tackles, right? I know Pro Football Focus uses stops as well. I don't know quite what their way of methodology. I think it's probably similar to mine, which is kind of like success rate, which looks at, down and distance on getting a tackle a certain down and distance. And if you get a certain number of yards, it's a successful play. And obviously if you get less than that, it's an unsuccessful play. And that's kind of the root of where sort of stops come from with me. And I think based off of what I've seen, my definition is probably a little stricter than PFF's. But, I had Troy Andersen with 0 stops in this game. So, sorry, AJ, he didn't make that many impact tackles. Like the one tackle he did was on special teams, where he had a touchdown saving tackle that prevented a touchdown there. But, other than that, like is probably the best tackle he made was late in the game in the fourth quarter on like a screen pass on Deebo Samuel, where he prevented him from getting a first down. But, fine. Like again, but outside of that, like not a whole lot of impact tackles. And so I know this is going to come off as very negative towards Troy Andersen. It's just, the tackle stuff is kind of a pet peeve of mine. But, I've also seen a lot of people like being like, oh, Troy Andersen should be a starter today. I'm like, okay, like maybe we want to relax on that. Now, if you're arguing that Troy Andersen should start over Rashaan Evans because he's going to give you a lot more value in coverage than Rashaan Evans is currently giving you, because Rashaan Evans ain't giving you much, I'm not going to necessarily push back on that. That's a worthwhile argument. But if you're out here being like Troy Andersen should start over Michael Walker, I'm like, oh, okay, like maybe you need to pump the brakes on the hype train a little bit, like let's slow down the engine a little bit there. Like, and that's coming from someone who's not necessarily in love with Michael Walker's play this year. Like last week, we talked extensively about the linebackers. And I think I said like Rashaan Evans is like a 4 out of 10 starter. Walker's been a little bit better, but probably not better than a 5 out of 10. And if I was evaluating Troy Andersen and not giving him on the rookie curve and just objectively or trying to objectively look at his performance on Sunday, it's like a 3.8 out of 10, So like, I don't get quite the hype on this. This is not necessarily because I'm down on Troy Andersen. I want to make that clear. I'm very optimistic and hopeful for what his development may be the rest of this season. I'm certainly optimistic and hopeful to see what jump he'll make from year 1 to year 2. And I do expect him to be a starter next season if he's not a starter by the end of this season. I don't know if praising Troy Andersen's performance on Sunday, I won't go as far as to say like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, because I hate when people say that. But like, everybody's entitled to their opinion. And you're even entitled to be wrong in your opinion. And I would just say that, people praising Troy Andersen's performance on Sunday are wrong. I think there are plenty of reasons still to be optimistic about Troy Andersen's future. I just would not necessarily use Sunday's performance against the 49ers as exhibit A in the case in why Troy Andersen is destined for stardom. I think he still has the potential to be the best linebacker on this team in time, but I would just say Sunday's game kind of reiterated to me, at least, that he still has a ways to go before he gets quite there. So that is just me. I can't ignore the bat signal. I'm just sitting there in my mansion late at night. The signal pops up on the sky, and I'm like, should I just stay here and play chess with Alfred, or should I go into town and beat up some poor people? And you know me, I got to go and beat up some poor people. It's what I got to do, swear to me. So sorry, got to do that. But we'll move on from Troy Andersen. We'll get into some of the listener questions. We'll take a deep dive into why the offensive line has improved, if it's improved in pass protection, and why it's improved in run blocking, and why that's owed to good coaching. We'll take a deep dive in AJ Terrell and some of his struggles, particularly looking at man coverage on today's episode. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find multiple shows devoted to not only local sports teams as well as national headlines. You got A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanisha Batiste. You got the Locked On Falcons postcast with Jarvis and myself every Sunday. And of course, the other shows on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, like Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks. I've heard, there's an NBA season starting up pretty soon. So go check out Brad Rowland and Locked On Hawks to see what that's all about. And you can find them all on the same podcast platforms that you're currently checking out Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. And guys, I want to tell you about your number one source for your sports betting needs and info this season. And that is, of course, betonline.net. You can find all the latest player developments, matchups, news, podcasts, in-depth articles, and analysis for every game, including this weekend's games. This weekend, the Falcons are 6-point underdogs on the road against the Cincinnati Bengals. Can the Falcons make it 7 weeks in a row that they cover the spread? We'll see. And I'm sure some of you guys haven't signed up at betonline.net because you're reluctant to bet on the Falcons and take advantage of this win streak against the spread because you don't want to jinx it. Well, guess what? You don't have to, right? Because BetOnline can be your continued source for all your sports wagering information, giving you live in-game betting and up-to-the-minute scores in every sport out there. It's not just the NFL, the NBA, college football, MMA, boxing, golf, so much more. Head to the website today at betonline.net. Use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. So, guys, speaking of Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, check out the Locked On Sports Atlanta Roku and Amazon Fire app. Just download Locked On Sports Atlanta so you can get that same great local sports coverage 24/7 for free on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So our first question comes from the Discord at God is Good. He asks, hey, Aaron, curious about what you think of AJ Terrell this year as a whole. Through 6 games, has he been targeted more this year than last year? If so, is it because last year's coverage was better? Yes, he has been targeted more this year, especially in man coverage. I'm going to use my charting, not Pro Football Focus's, just looking at man coverage. Through 6 games this year, he's been targeted 21 times in man coverage this year. Through the first 6 games he played last year, he was only targeted 5 times. Now, at the end of the season, if you look at the last 6 games of last year, he was targeted 18 times in man coverage. So that's a better apples to apple comparison to the first 6 games. So in the last 6 games of 2021, he was targeted 18 times, gave up 8 catches, 54 yards, 1 touchdown, no interceptions, 8 pass breakups, and a 70 passer rating. In the first 6 games this year, he's been targeted 21 times, given up 12 catches for 121 yards, 5 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 3 pass breakups for a passer rating of 113. So clearly you're seeing that he is not playing as well this year as he was a year ago. And a lot of that, I think, is leading to teams being less afraid to throw at him. And I think, part of it is also that he's being asked to cover number 1 receivers. And that has led to some of the issues in the red zone with the touchdowns, right? Where last year, throughout the entire season in man coverage, he was targeted only 12 times in the red zone. And this year he's been targeted 9 times in the red zone just through the 6 games. And you're often finding him locked up against opposing team number 1s like Michael Thomas, Allen Robinson. The 2 touchdowns to Brandon Ayuk, I credited Terrell with giving those up in man coverage this past week. And we've seen in weeks, throughout the year, when you're going up against number 1s, and I know this is a controversial subject here in Atlanta because, there's a big deal about, why can't the Falcons get the ball to Kyle Pitts? But most teams tend to not have problems, giving the ball to their go-to weapons, at least outside the state of Georgia. But that's going to lead you to get targeted, and those guys are good enough that they're going to win in some of those opportunities. And sometimes, like in the Seattle game where Seattle was trying to get the ball to Metcalf, Terrell made them pay for that. And then sometimes, like against the Saints, against the Bucks, and to a lesser extent against the 49ers, Terrell was on the losing end of that situation. So moving on to Rise Up question. He asks, Aaron, who did you see play well in the defensive line this week? If we're including edge rushers in the defensive line group, then obviously Arnold Ebiketie played really well in this game. But looking on the interior, Grady Jarrett, Taquan Graham, Abdullah Anderson, they were all solid in this game. Lorenzo Carter was also solid in this game, even if he didn't show up much in the box score. I think Grady Jarrett was relatively quiet in this game because he was mostly drawing double teams. So that will be something if we see a little bit of a regression from Grady Jarrett moving forward, if teams are successfully able to keep him limited. And obviously that's going to lead to needing Ebiketie to continue to step up like he did against the 49ers. But obviously the question is going to be against better competition. Will he be able to do that? Now, the other thing I would add about the D-line is I was very critical of guys like Timmy Horn and Matt Dickerson on Twitter the last couple of weeks in lieu of the Anthony Rush release, just simply because I didn't really buy that notion that they cut Anthony Rush because he's performing poorly, because I'm like, well, look at Horn and Dickerson. But to their credit, I think they've played better the last 2 weeks. So I'll say that. Rise Up's next question is, how would you rank every Mariota performance this year through 6 weeks? I'll be honest with you, I don't really remember that much about the first 3 games at this point, outside of the red zone mistakes, to really distinguish them, to stack them in a ranking or anything like that. I am assuming that he was better against the Seahawks, despite my poor memory, just because the Falcons were a lot more explosive in that game, and he had to have something to do with that, right? So if we're going from best to worst, I would say number 1, his best game was the 49ers game this past week. Then number 2 was the Bucks game. 3, probably Seattle. 4 or 5, toss them up, was the Rams or Saints game. And then 6 would be Cleveland. Andre Pennington's question at PinFun on Twitter asks, how did the Falcons improve so greatly on the O-line? And Spacebar on the Discord asks, something I'm interested in is the amount of pressure we're seeing on dropbacks. Is it one person or in particular getting beat, or is it failed blitz pickups? To answer Spacebar's question, no, the pressure has kind of been spread around. I think if you were to label one player the weakest link up front in pass protection, it would probably be Elijah Wilkinson through 6 games this year. But it does feel like most of the times the breakdowns in pass protection come where the Falcons fail to pick up like a stunt. There's a missed assignment on a blitz or something like that. So it does feel like a lot of their breakdowns are continuity, cohesion-based things that you hope with time you will see them improve on, also potentially related to having an inexperienced center. So some of those blitz breakdowns. So again, something that you hope will get better with more reps. As for the overall improvement and how the offensive line has improved, I think as far as the run blocking goes, I think the main issues are that I think Wilkinson and Dolman are upgrades over their predecessors in Jalen Mayfield and Matt Hennessy. I think with the rest of the unit, Matthews, Lindstrom, and McGarry have all been better run blockers this year than they were last year. And that's part of the reason why I give Dwayne Ledford and the coaching credit, because you're seeing that development. Now, obviously, the players also deserve a lot of the credit, because it's not as if Dwayne Ledford's on the sideline, using psychic powers to make these guys hit their assignments as run blockers. But you kind of get what I'm saying, where it feels like there's been development there. So that to me is a thumbs up for the coaching. When it comes to the pass protection, I do think the improvement there is mostly scheme related, which is also related to the coaching. I do think guys have been better this year, particularly McGarry, but I don't think it's a massive improvement for the team. And I think a lot of the scheme stuff is they're masking some deficiencies in pass protection and similar deficiencies that they had last year due to play action. As I said a couple of weeks back, Mariota's on this historic pace in terms of the usage of play action in the offense this year, at 48% of his dropbacks being play action. And you also see it kind of reflected in this other metric that PFF uses called true pass set, which basically eliminates play action passes, screens, rollouts, and moving pockets, 3-man rushes, also eliminates plays where the time to throw is less than 2 seconds. So like smoke routes where the offensive line isn't expected to hold their blocks for very long, or super long plays, like I think it's more than 4 seconds where the time to throw, where you're not expecting the offensive line to hold their blocks for as long. And so those are sort of trying to eliminate all the conditions that are meant to minimize or maximize the offensive line and scheme and whatnot. And this year, the Falcons through 6 weeks have 39 of those true pass sets, where it's just basically the offensive line doing their thing on an island. And last year through 6 games, that number was 92. And at this pace, if this pace continues this year, the Falcons are on pace through 17 games to only have about 110 true pass sets. And I don't know what the exact number is, but I think every team in the league last year had over 200 of those pass sets a year ago. And so, like, again, that goes back to the sustainability question, where it's like, can the Falcons maintain this pace for the next 11 weeks where they're basically able to scheme all the problems away in their pass protection? So for me, I wouldn't necessarily, at least based off of what I've seen so far this year, basically outside that Saints game, I don't know if the offensive line has really shown that they're significantly improved from last year outside of the Saints, outside of the scheme stuff, outside of that Saints game. You look at their pressure rates on like true pass sets, and, Wilkinson's a little bit better than Mayfield was, but not massively. Dahlman's a little bit worse than Hennessy was. Matthews is quite not at the same level. Lindstrom's a wash. McGarry's improved. So it's like you got two guys that are slightly better, two guys that are slightly worse. So it kind of all washes out to be the same. So like for me, like that's part of it where like I don't know if this unit is massively better in pass protection, but I think the scheme is due to the fact that you're having so much play action, hiding the fact that they're not significantly better. And so while I'll give the offensive line credit for improving in the run game, I'm not going to crow too loudly about any improvements in pass protection. I think some of the numbers like overall pressure rate, sacks, all that stuff can be a little bit misleading because you're not factoring in the scheme masking it. And so I want to make that clear, going back to the point of coaching being responsible for the improvements in run game. I think that's good coaching, right? That's not a bad thing that Arthur Smith is basically calling an offense as if he has a terrible offensive line, as if the offensive line is just as bad as it was last year, but he's doing things like dialing up the play action and whatnot to mask the fact that they're just as terrible or whatever, if you want to call it that, as they were last year. That's good coaching, right? Playing to your strengths, running the football, playing against your weaknesses, pass protection, straight drop back passing. That's good coaching. So I want to make that point clear, even if I'm not necessarily sold on the improvements from the pass protection. To me, it's all about great coaching on the Falcons' part, and part of the reason why, reluctant as I've been to give credit to this regime. I'm still not going to give Terry Fontenot any credit, but I'm kidding. But, the coaching has been significantly better this year. So we'll get to Harry and Gary's question as part of several questions. He asked, hey, Aaron, who do you think is the better back? Is Huntley or Allgeier? Trips asks, as a West Coast Dirty Bird, it's really hard not to get excited over this win, especially since I became a Falcons fan because I dislike the 49ers so much. With that being said, with basically the 49ers starting D-line being out and the 49ers dropping 2 wide open crucian passes, is it premature for me to think that we are able to dominate in the run game again like this against the number 1 run defense without Patterson? And with what we did against Tampa, that more teams should be afraid of our run offense than we should be afraid of their run defense. Also, when Patterson comes back, who gets the axe? I see no scenario where Huntley goes back to the practice squad. And Chill B asks, any reports on how soon CP and Damien Williams will return, and how in the world could Coach Art Smith manage the crowded backfield? #good problems. So all those came from Discord. Obviously, a lot of people are very concerned about, I think there was also another question about Huntley versus Allgeier as well that I might have missed. But to answer your question, Trip Z, if you're basically asking me, should we expect the Falcons to be able to run the ball effectively every single week? I think the answer is yes. Will that wind up being true? Time will tell on that. Even the best rushing offenses in the league typically aren't running for 100 yards every single week. The Browns this past week they're the number 1 rushing offense in the league, but they had to kind of abandon the run against the Patriots. I didn't watch the game, but at least looking at it looked like once they got into a 3-score hole in the second half, they kind of abandoned the run game. And we've seen the Falcons offense this year get into 3-score holes against the Rams and the Bucks, and they did not abandon the run game. And again, I think that goes back to, some of the things Arthur Smith knows, that like they can't play that alternative style of drop back passing attack and be successful. And maybe some week, as we saw against the Rams and Bucks, they still were able to get back into the game, thanks in part to the defense getting stops and the run game working. And maybe there will be games in the future where they don't get those stops and the run game doesn't work, and they won't be able to get back in those games. Time will tell on those issues. Now, to answer the question about whether Huntley is better than Allgeier, I think Huntley, from a trait standpoint, is probably a little bit better. I think he's a little bit quicker hitting the hole. I think he's a little quicker in and out of his cuts. It's kind of a similar dynamic to what Patterson and Davis had last year, where Patterson was a little quicker to hit that hole, and so I think he was a little bit more effective given the limited room that he was running behind. And Davis, because he has a tendency to have to kind of stop his feet to change direction, similar to Allgeier, which was one of my knocks on Allgeier coming out of BYU. That can lead to him not quite maximizing the yardage on any given carry. And you've seen a couple of times with Allgeier where he's tried to stick his foot in the ground and kind of cut off of one leg, and he's kind of stumbled and lost his balance this year. And so, I think that's an area that he can improve. Now, what I will say about that is, over 20 years of evaluating draft prospects, it's not common, but it's happened enough times where it could be possible that Allgeier can get better at that. I've seen a number of kind of these bigger plodding running backs kind of transform themselves, improve their footwork from the college game to the pro game, and become a lot more dynamic at the NFL level. Le'Veon Bell is probably the top example of that. Matt Forte was another guy that similarly did that. Rashad Mendenhall was another guy. You could say to a certain degree, not quite to the same degree as the aforementioned three, but Quadri Olson kind of did this. You can even make the argument that Caleb Huntley kind of did this, because he was kind of more that plotting back at Ball State, and now you're seeing a lot more explosiveness with the way he runs in the NFL. And so part of me wonders if Allgeier will do similar things and grow and develop in that regard. Now, another point that you've heard me make a number of times on the podcast when it comes to Allgeier versus Huntley, and why, even though I think Huntley is probably the better ball carrier, why we will continue to see Allgeier get his lion's share of the snaps as well as the carries, is because Allgeier seems to be the guy that the coaching staff trusts in pass protection, that his workload on passing downs is significantly high. Like, Huntley is hardly ever on the field in passing situations, while Allgeier is. And it goes back to a point you've heard me make dozens of times, where like ultimately kind of, running back is kind of determined by your pass protection skills, not necessarily your running skills. Obviously, if you're Nick Chubb or Derrick Henry or Alvin Kamara, then your skill set on offense is sort of what you bring to the table. But for everybody else, it's kind of a dime a dozen. So it's kind of that passing game ability that can really influence how much playing time you get. And I think that's a credit to Allgeier, because watching his tape at BYU, he was not a very good pass protector. He had the skill set to be a good pass protector, but he didn't show that consistently on the field. And that has been mostly a non-issue so far in the NFL. Although, again, going back to the previous point where the Falcons scheme is kind of masking, they're not really asking him to be the sixth man in those 6-man protections in the standard drop back passing game like most teams are asking their running backs to be. So we'll see if that holds form again for the rest of the season. Now, when Patterson comes back, I do expect it to be a 3-headed backfield. I do not expect the Falcons to cut any of their running backs. If anybody is vulnerable coming back from IR to be cut, it would be Damien Williams. But I think the Falcons can kind of just say, just hang out on IR until we need you, right? At this point in time. So I haven't heard anything about those, but I don't think the Falcons are going to rush those guys coming back, given how effective Huntley and Allgeier have been in their stead. And I do think when Patterson comes back, we will see the thing that we talked about throughout the summer and the spring, which is, the Falcons want to protect Patterson and limit his exposure to hits and limit that wear and tear, and may ask him to be more of a receiver than a true running back this year. And we talked about this quite a bit in May and June, in those episodes. You just go back and listen to those episodes. It's like, oh, well, basically go back and listen to those, where then we were reluctant to buy stock on the Falcons running game being good. The knock on Allgeier was like, well, he played behind a great offensive line that gave him plenty of room to run in college, but he's not going to get that in Atlanta. Obviously, that prediction was wrong, because that's exactly what's happened this year. But that goes back. And then the other tweak is that Huntley has been a bigger part of the running game Now, the interesting thing about Damien Williams, I think, is going to be because he also is valuable due to that pass protection skill. If and when he does return to the lineup, will he be inserted back in the offense because of that skill set, particularly if the Falcons are forced to have to go to more of a standard drop back passing game in a certain game or something like that? Or does he get relegated to playing more on special teams? We'll have to sort of see. You know, I have some more thoughts on Caleb Huntley, but we'll probably save those for a later day. But let's move on to the last question. It comes from Man at Sodi13 on Twitter. He asks, what do you think is our best possible record is? Because I think we can get 10 wins. Someone earlier on Twitter basically said he thought the Falcons could go 12-5 this year. I kind of was reluctant to endorse that. I certainly think it's possible. So I think 10 or even 12 wins is certainly possible. My expectation at this point is that the Falcons will win at least 5 more games. So they'll get to at least 8-9. That's my expectation based off of the 3-3 start. We'll see if they live up to that. I think they can win more. They could win less. We'll see. I think what's interesting, you look at websites like 538.com, they currently project the Falcons for an 8-9 record. They have them at a 35% chance of making the playoffs. Football Outsiders has their mean win projection at 8.7 wins. So 8-9 or 9-8. And they have them about a 44% chance of making the playoffs. And, you can take that stuff with a grain of salt if you want, but just interesting to me. Part of the reason why I'm not as willing to go all in on, projecting the higher win totals is just my general philosophy, which is, particularly coming off of wins, it's never as good as you think it is. And coming off of losses, my philosophy is the opposite, which is it's never as bad as you think it is. And so I try to stay even keeled with the stuff. And so I'm just going to be a little bit more patient than other people are. And part of me, my reluctance is like, I think coming off of this win, this impressive win, which it certainly was against the 49ers, maybe some people might be a little bit overzealous. And I get that from fans. So if you want to go all in and predict this team to win 10 or more games, then be my guest, leave a comment. Tell me how many wins you think the team is going to get. No beef with anybody who's going to be overly optimistic, if you want to call it that at this point in the season. Do you? But for me, I just try to be a little bit more patient. Now, we might be a month from now, I might be willing, if the Falcons, win 4 out of the next 5 or something like that, or more, or go 5-0, or over the next 5 games, then we'll definitely be having a different conversation and revising that win total expectation. But I can take it in stride. That's one of the benefits of doing a daily podcast, is it teaches you patience. You don't have to necessarily got to get all these takes off early on. We can wait, right? We can wait till tomorrow, or we can wait till next week, and there'll still be time to talk about this stuff. So I'm sure some of you are like, well, you're just reluctant because you're just a hater, Aaron. You're like, you know what, you're right. I love to pour that haterade in my coffee for the flavor every morning. So guys, that's going to do it here on today's episode of Locked On Falcons, our Q&A All-22 review. Tomorrow we'll be back with a crossover Thursday with the hosts of Locked On Bagels, James Rapine and Jake Liskow, and we'll get the lowdown on this Bengals matchup. It's going to be a tough matchup, probably going to be one of the tougher matchups we have until the bye week, at least theoretically. So we'll see if the Falcons can rise up. And of course, later in the week, we'll be joined by Jarvis Davis as well. And guys, if you want to know where you can submit questions for future Q&As, of course, you can do so via Twitter, via Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can leave a comment here on Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And you can also hit me up in the Locked On Falcons Discord. There is a link in the description below. So, guys, really appreciate it. Check out Locked On NFL. Check out Locked On Hawks. Check out Locked On Sports Atlanta. Check out Peacock and Williamson as well. Guys, really appreciate it. Till then.